take it off and tell me.
I mean, the power is right
It's like we'll just disconnect. It's like we're losing internet.
there if you want to turn it off or turn it on.
So it's been fun. So what's your wireless server? Had issues.
Hey, if where are you going to want to go from? I can move out of the way. You can be here. You can go to the other side. You can go wherever.
I don't have notes. I'll just move around. So I can go on the other side. Are you gonna stay up there?
Yeah, you work there.
I don't remember. What's slide 8? Okay.
Yeah, he was a drummer. Yeah, we're pretty hard on band stuff. You show her only the cool things.
But that, so,
ACU. There's so many people that we saw ran into that were ACU fans. I mean, obviously, we've always met at ACC. Yeah.
Morning.
Yeah, I went to Carlton, which is still part of the city, so I guess I can find that. So we met after college, so we saw Fox. My mom asked if he was all 4 years of didn't get married, if it was the core, or those dogs. What's wrong with it? Why didn't you get married? And that's when we met. So she was like, something. But he was just,
I mean, every minute that ticks off is one less I have to drag this out for you. No, I'm never teaching on this before. Especially the first week, I was trying to figure out what does 3 45-minute classes look like, and so I got through that first one. I was like, all right, I think I've got the scope of this and how far I can go. Yeah, I didn't turn off the projector clicker, so it's dead. I didn't know there was an off button on it, so.
how are you?
Use that first word.
Actually, the subtitle boxes. You know how many years are between the old and new? Yes. This is not something I would.
Did Addie go to
400.
Did Addie go to youth group?
That sounds like Eddie.
All right, I'll go ahead and get us kicked off as we do the final week of my class series, talking about between Malachi and Matthew, what happened between the Old and New Testaments matter. Good job. So I'm just going to do a brief recap. Week 1, we went deep in history, talking about a lot of the story. I'll touch on bits and pieces of that, but we don't have time to go back and do all that again. Last week we were very focused on conversation, which was what I wanted it to be. A lot of great comments as we were kind of working through what does this story mean to us? How does the first century Jew, how are they engaging with what had happened previously? We're going to keep going on there, but I really enjoyed last week with it. So last week we talked about the Maccabean revolt, which super summarized the ruler who was of Greek origin was he put down he squashed down Judaism, basically said all Judaism is outlawed. There was put up altars to foreign gods, to Greek gods, and which led to Malachi, the older guy on the right, squashing that. He has 5 sons. They lead a rebellion that overthrows the Greeks. And then from there, we talked about the 4 main Jewish sects that existed at the time of the first century that kind of grew out of this time period. Talked about the Pharisees, which we're obviously all familiar with, the Sadducees, which were more the Hellenized group, the Essenes, who were kind of, we talked about comparing monks or ones that would kind of recede from society and be as pious as they could be. And then the Zealots, who really sprung out once Rome came in, but were the ones who wanted to overthrow, wanted to take back power. That's good. You're good. Here is the map of the Hasmonean dynasty, which Maccabeans come in, take over power. That starts the Hasmonean dynasty. We talked about Judas at the top. I know that's a little fuzzy, but and it expanded, and the third person, Simon, is who we closed out on. So backtracking slightly, independence is gained in 142 BC. The final remaining son of Mattathias, Simon, is named leader and high priest, sowing division as he wasn't, as we talked about last week, he wasn't from the lineage of David, and he was not from the tribe of Levi. Simon leads the people through 6 years of peace and prosperity, growing the kingdom. His son-in-law, who's the governor of a neighboring Seleucid region, the Seleucids were the ones that they took over power from, throws a banquet and invites Simon, the leader of Judea, and his sons to attend. They succeed in killing Simon and his 2 sons, but John Hyrcanus, who is his 3rd son, who we see as Hyrcanus the first, doesn't attend the banquet, and so the plan to kill the lineage fails, and John Hyrcanus becomes the new leader. And there's war for a short time in the land with the Seleucids, who attack Jerusalem. Again, during this time, the Seleucid king dies, and they retreat under their new ruler, and order is restored. The Hasmonean dynasty continues. John Hyrcanus sought to expand their territories and successful both to the north and to the south. This expansion would continue under his son Aristobulus, and later his other son, Alexander Jannaeus. While Aristobulus and Alexander were descendants of devout ancestry, they both fell further and further from Simon and John Hyrcanus' ideals of traditional Judaism that they believed in strongly, going back all the way to Mattathias. You could attribute this period as they did what was right in their own eyes moment. And some, like we talked about, I think that may have been 2 class periods ago, some might look at these guys as the moments before a new storm came through. The Pharisees were alarmed by the situation and the turning from the traditional ideals, and they were willing to go to extremes to get their way. They reached out to what was left of the Seleucid Empire and invited them to come and to overtake Judea once again. So in 87 BC, the Seleucids went along with that plan and began to invade, which caused the Hasmonean leaders and Sadducees to flee to the countryside. The Pharisees, realizing what they had brought upon their people, joined back with the Hasmoneans as a united front, and due to the Seleucid army being less powerful than their predecessors than they were previously, the united Jews were able to regain the territory after a brief struggle. This didn't end the strife between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as you can assume. The Pharisees demanded Alexander Jannaeus, who was the leader, choose between the roles of king and high priest. In response, Alexander openly sided with the Sadducees by adopting their rites in the temple. His actions caused a riot, leading to a brief civil war that ended with bloody repression of the Pharisees. On his deathbed, Alexander calls for reconciliation between the two parties. So Alexander would have been the bottom. His empire at this time would have been expanded to the full, all the colors you see there at this time at 76 BC. So in 76 BC he dies, and he's succeeded by his wife Salome Alexandra, who was the first female to rule the land since Deborah in the days of the judges. She inherits a sizable region, as you can see from Alexander. And I mean, this is pretty, we're looking at a similar size to what you would have seen at the time of Solomon. Certainly the size, a little bit larger than the size when David was king. So there would have been a lot of, we're living in another great time for us as a people. She inherits a sizable region, and she proceeds to enlarge it slightly to the northeast and south, which you don't see in this picture. Politically, she sided with the Pharisees, and she drew the ire of the Sadducees. In spite of the political rivalries that continued through her reign, there was peace over the 10 years that she reigned. Salome Alexandra dies in 67 BC. Now, Salome and Alexander Jannaeus had two sons, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Salome named Hyrcanus her successor, but after 3 months, Aristobulus rose up in rebellion. He gets the army to switch over to his side, and he takes the throne over from his brother. But Hyrcanus, with the assistance of some of Jerusalem's upper class, made efforts to wrestle leadership back. So these two sons are trying to say, which one of us is going to be the next ruler over us. So now, Roman expansion, which has obviously been taking place, is in. We're looking at 67 BC. So that would have been right about. We're looking at the expansion from this kind of pinkish reddish onto the orange where it's coming into the area is around this time frame. And once again, all these maps show particular times and places, so it's obviously going to be more complex than this, but that's roughly the expansion that took place. Rome was on a crash course with Judea, as you can see, and as we know from history. The brothers switched gears, understanding that they could not resist Judea's inevitable outcome as a future vassal of the Roman Empire. They meet with Pompey's representatives, and they each make pitches for why they should retain leadership of the region. So they still, even though they see the writing on the wall for what's approaching, they still are trying to say, I should be the one to be a ruler under you. And Pompey ends up siding with Hyrcanus II, though he would never be king and leader of an autonomous group again. So in 63 BC, sovereignty is lost for good. And there wouldn't be another independent Jewish state in the region until 1948. So this is, 67 BC, we're talking about the end of an era that, we're thousands of years we're talking about between this, 2,000 years. The Hasmonean dynasty, however, would continue under Roman rule until 36 BC when Herod took control, setting up the Herodian dynasty that would rule until 100 AD. So that sort of closes out the Maccabean story, the Hasmonean story. That comes to an end. Rome comes in. We know what Roman rule in the area looked like. That's sort of a closing of that chapter. So you can go ahead and get to the next one. Let's look at 63 BC, similar to how we did in 142 BC in the first class, when the Jews gained independence. Using the same calculation I used earlier, the Jewish people lost independence 58 years before the birth of Jesus. 58 years ago was 1965. So I want to put this in context to what, how long ago that would have been in their eyes. So also in 1965, we see Lyndon Johnson being sworn in his first full term. U.S. involvement in Vietnam enters its 10th year. Prior to the Civil Rights Bill becoming law, Martin Luther King Jr. leads the march in Selma, Alabama. The Sound of Music is released, and the Colt 45s become the Astros, and the Astrodome opens. So, to even put this into closer context, the chant, "Let's go Astros," would have been said probably for the first time in as close as it was that Jesus was born, would have been born into an independent Judea. This is close. We're not talking, it's easy for us when we read from the Gospels, from Acts, from the letters. We're not far removed from a time where they would have been free. This would have been conversations that were happening in homes. Anyone 58 years of age or older at the time of Jesus' birth would have been born as citizens of Judea, not citizens of the Roman Empire. This immediately brings to mind Simeon and Anna from Luke 2, the two who identified Jesus as Messiah at the temple in Jerusalem shortly after his birth. We don't get Simeon's age, but it says that he wouldn't see death before he had seen the Lord's Messiah, so he's probably getting up there in years. Anna, however, is said to have been 84. So assuming Simeon is older than Anna or younger, these two, along with many other Jews, would have been born in a free Judea. For Anna, she would have been 26 years old when Rome came to town. So we can see how this story, like I said, this is relevant. These are recent events that took place. I'll just throw out a hypothetical situation that will bring us even closer to our home. Let's say World War II went very differently, with the Axis powers triumphant over the Allies. America falls, and we're living under the oversight of Tokyo or Berlin. America's rights are limited, and we have foreign soldiers keeping tabs over our lives. Do you think there would be talk of the days before foreign occupation? Do you think there would be discussions about finding a leader who would rise up to give us freedom once again? Humans now are like humans were. There is a desire for autonomy. There is a desire to rule ourselves, for better or worse sometimes. But there is that. This is, so I'll ask this question. How does this history inform us of the potential thinking of first century Jews forced to live under Roman rule?
Saw them as oppressors.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we see the zealots spring out of this. This is not a calm. It's not a throw up your hands and say, this is the current way things are. This is the ways of old. We've done something to lose. Yeah, go ahead.
They also, because they was under the law for so long, it was hard for them to bring in the new without dragging in the old.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Weren't the Romans rather historically, weren't they rather lenient with their indigenous regions as long as you paid your taxes to Caesar?
Yeah.
And you may worship your God if you wish and do what you wish as long as you what was the catalyst that destroyed that attitude for them? Was it the zealots, those who were trying to rescue? I know all the stories.
Sure.
About the sieges and all that, but what brought that about?
What brought
The sudden, okay, Rome says, okay, this is the last straw. This is it. Destroy the temple.
Well, that would have been the Greeks. So we talked about in the first week.
Caesar Nero, was he not responsible for the?
And what year would that have been?
67.
Yeah. So I don't know about that. I don't know specifically the things that would have brought that on. I didn't take this into that far into the future. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
In that
it
regard?
was,
Yeah.
was one of the instances that helped bring it all about. Because that was, to the Romans, that was almost the last straw.
What was that?
Masada. Yeah.
Yeah. So there would have been. It depends who you would ask. Like we talked about, I think last week. There's not a one thing that the Jewish people were at this time. There was, like we talked about, there's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots. That's just high level thinking. Individually, there would have been all kinds of thinking. There would have been the ones that said we need to go in now. This isn't how we were supposed to be. This isn't how we were supposed to live. We're to be as David called us to be. Yeah.
Nothing can unite a people like an external boogeyman.
Mm-hmm.
Dictators have used it
Yeah.
for forever. But even with all the differences, there were probably a lot of things they could agree on. One, that they were better off before.
Yeah.
And so when they all come together, it's a significant issue for the Romans. And probably, it's more, okay, like you said, okay, enough is enough, squash.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about that last slide, Rome is a giant force that is sweeping the world as they knew it. There's stories of when, as Rome would come through, are you going to be under our rule? Are you going to live as we want you to live? If the answer is no, the city's gone. I'm trying to remember, there's two cities, in just a second. There's two cities as they're coming through that are north of Judea that said, no, we're not going to become Romans, and they're decimated. Every life is killed. The city is ruins. If you're not going to play by our rules, you're not going to be on the map. You're not going to be known to history if we can do anything about it. You play by our rules. If you play by our rules, we can have some conversations, and we can live in a way that works for you to a degree. I think, in my opinion, it might look very similar to the way that the Hellenization took place, where, if you'll do it the way that, under our parameters, and you don't try to, overthrow us, we're going to be lenient, but, those taxes better come in. Whoever we say is in charge is going to be in charge, and, don't push us in those regards, or we'll come through like we did those other cities. Do you have a comment?
I just wanted to say a thought came to me. It's when the disciples had said Caesar had his face on the money. And Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar, render to God what is God.
Yeah.
The separation right there.
Absolutely. And the layers that are going on with that story, are we under this man? Is this man on this coin? Is this our God? Or is, there's layers to that. There's the story, there's the sides, there's the parties. Because the Sadducees would say, let's do what we need to do to better ourselves, to make sure we are in alignment with the Roman powers. The Pharisees, they're trying, asking questions. They're being, they want traditional Judaism. They want it to be the way. Essenes are removing themselves. Zealots certainly aren't wanting to, pay homage to Caesar. So it's a complex question. Thank you for bringing that up. That's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of the big picture of several centuries that you've been covering. There's a sense in which the Jewish people have had various groups come in. You have the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, Seleucids. So through all of that, they're looking for leaders to drive them out so they can have their independence.
Absolutely.
And so, as you're moving into the time of Jesus, they're constantly looking for leaders and beginning to associate this Messiah idea into the next person that's going to provide them the freedom that they're seeking.
Absolutely. There's definitely
the bigger recurring theme.
Absolutely. Yeah, Messiah is going to there wouldn't have been anybody talking about Messiah as someone who's going to come and yeah, it's someone who's going to come in and is going to restore us to what we are called to be. And called to be, like we talked about, there's going to be a lot of perspectives on what would have been called to be depending on what group you're talking about. But it certainly would have been autonomy. It certainly would have been a Judean, Israeli, Jewish country, because that's what it always was. When when they were doing right in the eyes of God, they were their own people.
And then to have the message of Jesus. Okay, thank you, descendants of Abraham. You have fulfilled the promise. You're no longer needed.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's not the message they wanted to hear.
Yeah. And as he's drawing in followers and he's sort of creating this new thing, and it's not looking like what they think it's going to be, that's complicated.
And
That's complex.
We foretold to the disciples the total destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
one stone will be left upon the top of the other.
Yeah, which that doesn't sound like a very good empire to me.
No, it doesn't.
That doesn't sound like what we want. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
It seems interesting, I hadn't really thought about this before, with all of this going on, the gist of the New Testament, you read about the Jews, their main adversaries seem to be Christians. And you don't really read about Rome as much,
Yeah.
being the real big bad guy.
There's certainly a shift in focus as the New Testament is telling a new story, and sort of it's our old way versus our new way, which that's sort of the conversation we've been having throughout this. What do we do when a new story comes to town, when a new empire comes to town, when we have a new leadership, or we have Sadducees in control, Pharisees in control, when there's there's always going to be competing values when you have autonomous rule. Which story are we going to embrace?
Yeah. We're seeing about the freedom that Paul had to go out and arrest, capture Christians, people who converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
In the midst of all of this, under Roman rule, and the Romans kind of sat back and let that happen. But
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know, I just hadn't really thought about it in that context
Yeah,
before. But
that's
it's
good.
a different light on the way you frame the New Testament.
Well, a lot of these groups saw the Christians as outside of at least their common drive for worldly independence.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to drive consensus and all get on the same bandwagon, to fight against the Romans, if you've got an internal group that's growing real fast that doesn't really hold on to your same values against Rome,
Yeah.
then that can be a problem.
Yeah.
And they did, like Marty said, they did have some freedom to go persecute these heretics,
Yeah.
and so they did.
Yeah. And then trying to embrace the Gentile. When you talk about trying to grow the kingdom throughout the world, what does that look like? Whose flag are we doing this under?
Especially when a lot of Romans led themselves to Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. That's.
It was surprising to see
Yeah.
how many Romans converted
Yeah. Yeah.
during Jesus' day.
And even among contemporary Christians today, we argue among ourselves about what precisely that scripture means. There are people who believe the beast was Nero for destroying Jerusalem.
Yeah.
There are people who believe the beast was the Roman Catholic Church for 1,000 years.
We don't have to.
People who
Yeah.
believe the beast hasn't arrived yet.
Yeah.
I
There's a long list of beasts that.
got a beastly literature out there.
All right, I'm gonna transition. Let my esteemed brother come take the floor for a little while, take us through the next part.
Have we got some questions for you?
Yeah, we've been planning.
I'll just drop whatever I prepared. Go ahead. So my name's Colin, and I'm not a historian like my brother is. I'll tell you. I went through grad school and never got all the. We dealt with the Bible, not this in-between mess, right? But as we've been talking today, I've been thinking about how, we are the stories we tell ourselves. And it matters the stories we choose to tell and those that we don't. And I think about my own kids. Maddox is my oldest. We've got two others as well that are younger than him. Like, we grew up with certain nursery rhymes and stories that we wanted to tell. I've got movies that before he graduates high school, I want to make sure he sees, right? I have a responsibility as a parent to make sure he's prepared for the world. But there's certain stories that aren't on the top of my list for him to see necessarily. And the ones I want him to see may have nostalgic value for me. It may be something that we saw, that was a tradition at Christmas growing up that I want to pass down. But underneath all that, there's morals, there's stories, there's a purpose, we're trying to craft a vision of what the kingdom of God is. And so there's certain parts about American history that we want to share. And then we want to, and schools are in this conversation right now, right? I mean, we're in a battle over what is our history and what do we tell, and what is too negative a story and what is too positive a story, and what can first graders take and what can, all that is the conversation because the stories we tell shape what we do. This is a challenge for children's ministry, right? Your children's Bibles are trying to make those decisions. What can children take at different levels? And so you've got different levels of Bibles, and And certain churches may go deeper into some of those details, and others are going to stay high level. VBS is kind of like, later on today, I'm going to be talking about the Jonah story. I heard that in VBS. I don't remember hearing Nahum, which is the other book I'm going to talk about in that. They're both about Nineveh, but our kids can hear the Jonah story and think it's about a fish, but there's going to come a day where they realize this is about more than a fish. And so you've done this, right? As you've continued to read Scripture, you've grown into a deeper reading. But the stories we tell matter. And so when Jesus is born, I never really thought about Mary and Joseph having this incredible task of like, they're telling stories. Think back to Moses, right? Like Jochebed's got stories, nursery rhymes that she's telling. What are those stories? And how does that shape Moses? And does that shape him to kill an Egyptian in the midst of the background? And then find out maybe that wasn't God's way? All that to say, we have these stories that are told, and the stories that we tell matter. And so if you're growing up in one of those four families, right? Sadducee, Pharisee, Zealot, Essene, you're getting different stories told, probably. Different parts of Scripture are being highlighted, and others are being diminished. So if you're a Zealot family, what do you think are the stories that you're telling more? Let's talk about just Scripture. Which of those stories might rise to the top from the Old Testament?
Feeding the Philistines.
Yeah, we took down the Philistines once. We can do this. You said Samson? Samson would be a great story, right?
And Jehu taking out Jezebel.
Jehu, right?
Yep.
What others? There's lots of good stories for zealots to tell, right?
Well, they can tell the victories and the defeats. The defeats are very motivating.
That's right. That's right. The common enemy, right? The sense of here's where we failed, and we need these
Not where
heroes.
we failed, but look at us, the victims.
Okay. So the victim story matters too. Yeah.
And that's very powerful.
Now, if you're a Pharisee, though, what are the stories that you highlight for your kids?
Giving them the law.
The law, right? Yeah. I mean, Moses, that Egyptian story, that's the one the zealots want to tell. But to my kids, the Ten Commandments, God carved this into stone. They carried it with them through the wilderness. And it matters that what other stories for the Pharisees might rise to the top?
Get it right. Any story that would say
You gotta
I'm
get it
thinking
right.
of,
Yeah.
Who was it? Uzzah? The guy.
Oh, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
It was just a
That's right.
doing something good. What are you talking about? And I touched it.
Uzzah is
and
the
I lost my
slippery
life.
slope,
Okay,
isn't he?
You've got
Yeah.
to be. Oh, yeah, I can imagine they're telling stories like that. You better get it right.
That's it. That's exactly. What about the Sadducees? What stories might they be highlighting for their kids? We don't know the Sadducees as well because they're so sad. You see.
By the, they were the
Yeah, foreign powers.
You might hear things that weren't even Jewish.
So you go outside of the scriptures, maybe, and of course you've got those historical stories as well, not just scripture that they're pointing to.
The Sadducees was also loyal to the priests.
Okay,
So, of course, they're gonna encourage you, whatever is right to do this.
that's right.
That, and they passed that on.
Yeah,
But also wanted to add too, you remember God had told them to tell their children when they had to throw stones out of the water, as a reminder to tell these stories.
yes, the Ebenezer, right? Yeah. That's great, and that's what they're doing, right? The telling of stories is the raising of the Ebenezer. It's the pointing back to say, here's where God was active in the past. What about I'm not leaving out the Essenes, I guess, right? What would be the stories of the Essenes that might be highlighted that they're telling their kids?
Being out of the world, stepping away, being separate.
Yes, yeah. Are there particular examples you can think about that might be along those lines?
There were a few prophets who were let's say, sequestered, but they lived off out in the mountains alone, so.
Yeah.
So there are others in
Yeah.
the past who have gone out and lived alone and sequestered themselves.
Yeah. So you see that there's plenty of material here to highlight the things you want to highlight based on the perspective you have. And that creates expectations in the kids about who this Messiah will be. Different stories about Messiahs that are probably going around. And when you have a story that's being told and you have a vision about what that Messiah will be, then it's like when you buy a new car you've never had before and then you see it all over the road, right? Like, you're setting up your expectation, your vision to see certain things you didn't see before, and that causes you to not see things as well, right? And so the challenge of these groups together and others will be, as they're looking for a Messiah, they're looking for different things. And so you've seen the slide that's up here, power over versus power under. When you hear that phrase, what comes to mind? What might power over look like? What might power under look like?
So we have this concept in the United States.
Okay.
Where, I realize politicians like to emphasize the prepositions, but the rest of it's like government of the people, by the people, for the people. Okay, Madam Congresswoman or Mr. Congressman, you and your colleagues in Washington are not the government. We are. And we hire you to do a job for us, and if we don't like the job you're doing, we'll put somebody else in there.
Right.
We are the government.
Okay.
But there are others who would suggest that no, those people in Washington are the government. And
Right.
so there's a very
Yeah.
argument about wait a minute, who's in charge here?
Yeah. Very different stories by our political parties about these kinds of things as well, right? What does that look like?
Power over to me is just looking at this, not really sure where you're going.
Yeah.
Maybe that rabbit hole. Power over is, to me, it says, I think of dictators.
Yeah.
I think of people or situations where the power flows from the top.
Yeah.
Okay. Power under is, to me, is more of a taking charge regardless of who's in power, of using the power that you have, or in some cases given, and using that to do whatever it is you need to do.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say, but power under is a little bit more confusing, but I think it is a strength.
A strength, quiet strength, or you can talk about positional authority versus kind of relational, or
Exactly.
and the leaders aren't always those that are titled, right? Because there's different kinds of power and influence and authority.
I
Yeah.
have a thought that
Uh-huh.
just ran across my mind.
Yes.
It may not be right, but I think about how Moses, he was empowered to do what God had suggested him to lead the children of Israel, and then to bring them on out to the promised land. When his job was done, regardless of the circumstances, his job was done, that baton was passed on. So his power was gone. This next person take over. When that person's power is gone.
That's right. There's a chain of leadership that comes. So what Clark was describing earlier, one more comment? Did I miss? Oh, yeah.
Ask if this is related to what we talked about the first week about rule, like the power of rule versus the power of love, and which is more important.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm headed, and I appreciate that comment. I'm glad that this was talked about first week one, so I missed that piece. But yeah, I think that's what I'm trying to aim toward. There's all kinds of ways to think about power over and power under, but for our purposes, what Clark was describing earlier was really what's referred to as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, right? And the peace of Rome was, as long as you play by our rules, you pay your taxes, things are going to be peaceful around here, right? And it's interesting about peace, because we tend to think about peace as the absence of conflict, but there's a peace, the shalom, the Jewish idea is really the presence of the fullness, the presence of the wholeness, the presence of true peace. Like, you can have a quiet peace in the car coming to church when the kids are acting up and you yell at them and say, and here's the punishments that come down. A peace can be created through power over, in that sense of this is how it's going to be. But that doesn't mean there's true peace, right? Like, we've lived in households, some of us, where there was peace, but there wasn't peace, right? Maybe you'll be at a Thanksgiving table later this week. Well, there may not be the things said, but there's things underneath it that are still there.
The peace was enforced.
That's right. And that was how Rome went at it, right? There's going to be peace around here. We're going to make sure that happens. Jesus didn't go about things that way. Jesus chose power under. How he's born into the world, like he's not born into a place of power. Like, the choice of God, the Father, was the choice to send Jesus to this young couple on the edges of this empire Shepherds are the ones who are around it. The story we're about to celebrate at Advent and Christmas is a story of power under. It's a specific choice. I don't think it was just kind of spin the wheel and random that he ends up there. I think that's an intentional choice by the Father to say, this is who I'm going to send Jesus to, which is a choice in this encounter. I want to go back quickly, and I know we got to move on to the end of the class, so I want to take my seat here in just a moment. But 1 Samuel 8 is a story that's always intrigued me. 1 Samuel 8 is a story about Israel asking for power over. Of course, they've had the Promised Land, and they've gone their route through the Exodus and what happens in the stories before that. But in 1 Samuel 8, they're looking around them at all these other nations, and they're realizing all these nations have a king, they have soldiers, they have all these things, and they're thinking, well, maybe we should look like the other nations so that we can have the same seeming peace that they have. And so they cry out in this story. Samuel's growing old, his sons aren't following after him, and so they say, well, this isn't going to go well if Samuel's kids are leading us, but we want to be like all the other nations. And isn't there that desire? We've all said that as kids probably. Why are we so different from all the other kids, right? Why can't we just... I hear those same things today, right? And the option there is this desire. And Samuel is just so put off and frustrated by this because he knows that Israel's king's been Yahweh, right? Yahweh's the one. They don't need a positional king like all the other nations. They were never supposed to be like all the other nations. That's a power over move that they're saying, if we just had this place, this thing in here, and Samuel goes to God and he's like, don't be upset. They're actually rejecting me, not you, Samuel. But he goes, you can give the people this option. They can choose one of two ways. But if they choose power over, if they choose to put a king in place, if they choose to look like all the other nations, he's going to tax you to no end. He's going to take your daughters off to his harem. He's going to take your sons off to war. And when you come back crying to me, I am not going to hear you. So your choice. I'm giving this up to you. Free will, your choice. You're going to choose power over or power under. I'm your king. We can go about this another way, or you can look like all the other nations. And they opt for that route. Saul comes in. We see what happens in the aftermath. Exactly what God says will happen is what happens. Part of why exile in this whole middle zone happens. As Jesus comes into the world, I think he shows us this difference. And you can see it in the triumphal entry, in the entry of Jesus in Jerusalem. That same week, Herod would have been coming into Jerusalem because it was the Passover week. In order to keep the Pax Romana, it was important for for Pilate, to be present there. And so Pilate comes into town, and he would have ridden into town on war horses, right? That's how a king walks into town. That's what power over. You demonstrate your power by how you enter into the city. And in that story, it's interesting because how does Jesus show up in the city? Not on war horses, donkeys, right? He kind of strolls in. They have these palm branches that they welcome him in with. That's a reference to some Old Testament stories about how the king would enter in. Very different way. What he's demonstrating is a different kind of power. It's a power under. He's actually in some ways lampooning power over. Right? He's coming in a different way, and there are plenty of people on the other side of the city that say, we want power over. That's the way we're going to enter in. Jesus is coming in, and he's making a political statement is what he's making. My way is about a different kind of way. And of course, all these expectations would be coming in, and some are accepting Jesus and others aren't. There's been this whole interaction in his ministry between the Pharisees and him, and he's got zealots that are in his 12. Those four groups are represented basically there in the 12 disciples. It's fascinating that he doesn't pick a side. He's like, come, I'm showing you another way, not trying to pick between the four of you. But he dies and he's resurrected. And I want to just read one verse from Acts 1:6 before I pass this off to Clark again. That kind of draws this class, I think, to a close with a question kind of our own day and what that might mean for us. Power over, power under. We still have this choice. We still have people that are advocating for different ways when it comes to this in our modern age. And the stories we tell our kids, Marvel stories have that's telling a narrative about things, right? The stories we tell matter. But in Acts 1:6, right, we're picking up, Jesus said, don't leave Jerusalem, this is verse 4 and 5, but wait for the gift my Father's promised, which you've heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you'll be baptized with the Holy Spirit. So he's in his last, and they cut him off in his last words before he's about to ascend to heaven. And they got a question for him. And I want you to hear this question in light of this whole class and the expectations that are there and this power over, power under dynamic. They say, then they gathered around him and asked him, Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus is going, I might as well get out of here. These guys didn't get it. It's back to 1 Samuel 8. It's the same old, okay, Judas and the Maccabees and all these stories they've been hearing are in their imagination. And they look different from the 4 different groups. So this question, probably different ones of them are thinking about that question differently. Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? It's still about Israel, not Genesis 12, 1-3, not all nations through Israel. It's still about and Jesus goes, it's not for you to know the times. He just kind of blows off their question. It's not for you to know the times or dates the Father set by his own authority, but you'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you'll be my witnesses, martyrio. You'll be my martyrios, martyrs, in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And then he goes up. I just cannot imagine the frustration of Jesus, how he enters into the world, the teaching he's been doing, his telling Peter to put his sword aside as he's trying to live out a certain way about all this. I mean, you think back through the Gospels, all these stories, they all have stories in their minds. Their parents have shaped them to see the Messiah in a certain way. He shows up, he's the Messiah, he's preached this message, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek. All these things that he's saying are here, and they're still asking a question about this. And that's going to be a confusion for the next 2,000 years.
Yeah.
One question, I'm going to pass it off to Clark, or comment, yeah.
It's hard to teach people the opposite of the way they've been conditioned.
That's exactly right.
Which is exactly how he came in, power under.
Yeah.
Power through submission and servitude.
Yeah.
You know, he took the lowliness and said, in the spiritual kingdom, the servant is the greatest.
That's right.
And they were
That's right.
absolutely, that was just dumbfounded to them because they looked down on servants.
That's right.
So it's just...
It's hard for us to rewire.
The flesh is opposite of the spirit.
That's it.
And that's just the way
that's
it's
it.
always been.
Still is, right? That's right. That's right. Clark.
All right. Go ahead and take the next one. So, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. I wasn't terribly familiar with this until this week. But this image is a drawing that was discovered on a wall of an ancient boarding school near Palatine Hill, which was the center of the Roman Empire. Estimates put it at being created, crafted into the wall around 200 AD. What it's depicting is a man worshiping a crucified donkey-headed man, and the inscription translates to Alexamenos worships his god. Just take this in for a moment. I spent a lot of time with this picture. I'm thinking, young adolescent boys finding somebody to pick on and finding a way to lower someone, make a joke, do whatever. So what I want to take from this, or just kind of speak towards this, to a world where prestige, wealth, and power are the markers of a life that is well lived. Discipleship of a man who was dishonored, poor, and died a criminal's death at the hands of empire is incomprehensible. This image, created to mock an Alexamenos, shows us the response to Messiah that the world could not predict and still struggles to understand. It displays a Messiah that was willing to lower himself to the extreme position of giving up his life. The Messiah that the world predicted, or the Jews would have predicted, would have only taken life. I read the story of a pastor recently preaching from the Sermon on the Mount, quoting Jesus in his calls to live an alternative lifestyle of service and submission. Afterward, he was approached by a member who reprimanded him, saying, yes, but that doesn't work anymore. That's weak. That might have worked in the past, but desperate times call for desperate measures. We don't have to be connected to the 24/7 news cycle to see the desperate times that we're living in. There's death, destruction, and chaos happening in all directions. Taking a look in this class at history, that does show that we're not unique to that. That's the story of this world. It's easy for us to look back at Jesus' followers and say, how could the Jews have rejected Jesus? They saw his miracles. They heard him speak with the authority of God. They saw him raise people to life that were dead. How could they have not seen it? However, he didn't give them power. He didn't take down Rome. They might have said, we know what anointed ones are supposed to do. They're supposed to take down the Goliaths. They're supposed to take power. They're supposed to build empires. Can you see the problem here? If our eyes are on power and prestige, Jesus isn't our king. But if our eyes are on love, peace, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, it raises a different question. I'm going to read from Mark 15. This is as Jesus has been arrested. He's going through the process that eventually leads to his crucifixion. This is Mark 15, 6 through 15. Now at the festival, Pilate used to release a prisoner for them, anyone for whom they asked. Now a man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists and had committed murder during the insurrection. Don't know the details of this insurrection. There is a power over move that's taking place, and Barabbas is in the midst of it. He's been thrown in jail for it. So the crowd came and began to ask Pilate to do for them according to his custom. Then he answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas for them instead. Pilate spoke to them again. "Then what do you wish me to do with the man who you call Jesus, who you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Why? What evil has this man done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas for them, and after a flogging of Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. So I see this sort of as a culmination of the story that I've been telling that we talked about earlier. Every day we wake up and we have a choice of who we're going to serve. And I think it's important we think about who we're going to serve. Are we going to serve who the world calls us to, or are we going to as Christians, are we going to serve Jesus and what he calls us to? So that's what I got. I'm going to close this out, and we're a few minutes early, but that's all right. Lord, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the time together. Thank you for everybody in this room. I ask that you would guide our steps, that you guide our paths. That every day as we wake up and we have choices to make, Lord, that you would call us to your ways, to your kingdom that you are setting up. Help us to partner you with you in that journey. Thank you for all the lives in here. Watch over us as we go our ways this week and spend time with family and have good memories that we can share. We love you, and help us to be closer followers of you. In your name I pray. Amen.